I guess we're live. I see the green light on.
Yeah.
Well, do you want to introduce and kick us off?
Kick us off, yeah? Yeah. I don't know. I'll just introduce myself and then you'll do the same. But
I think so.
Thank you very much for joining us, and to the Turbine Art Fair for organizing this. So my name is Musa N. I'm a photographer and an artist based here in Johannesburg. And yeah, I'm so excited to have a chat with you, Greg. So yeah.
Me too, Musa. It's a fantastic opportunity. I'm a photojournalist, or maybe former photojournalist and documentarian. I'm now based in Cambridge, Massachusetts in the USA, and I teach at Boston University and Harvard. And it's very nice to speak to someone who's still back in South Africa and aesthetically engaged and dealing with issues. So I think this could be a great chat.
Yeah. So I don't know, I just thought about, how we can go on about this, or how to start it, and I think, giving a bit of a background on how one has gotten to do what they do is quite like a nice way, kind of like to give people like the context and also as an icebreaker, and I don't know, do you want to start just giving us a background on how you got into photojournalism and photography?
Sure, of course. Well, I obviously grew up in the depths of apartheid, and as I was coming into my maturity, finishing school, it was starting to become obvious that apartheid could end, or it could get drastically worse. And I was never interested in photography at all, or journalism, in fact. But I was politically interested, and I started exploring areas around Johannesburg, Alex, Soweto, and then as I got older and living on my own, I started doing the Bantustans, and it was very interesting. And I was interested in writing about them and this experience. And I think I could. And then I went to university in Pietermaritzburg at the height of the war in KwaZulu-Natal. And essentially, I spent my whole time there really engaging with people who'd been displaced by the violence, kids who were trying to finish their matric and trying to get them through that, and arguing with white Rhodesians who'd recently left an independent Zimbabwe. So politics was really quite important and quite key. And I, from being kind of lost about what I wanted to do, I discovered something really interesting. I still wasn't into photography. Eventually, I would start doing photography as an aside to my writing. And I didn't think much of it. I wasn't interested. I wasn't particularly connected to it. And obviously, I wasn't particularly good. But then I had I had a Nikon that was stolen, and I was still living with my uncle and aunt. I had the insurance, and it paid for all this secondhand gear. And I bought a large format camera, a medium format, and a Nikon. And I ended up with this full set of gear that suddenly I fell in love with photography when I started shooting 4x5. And I learned how to do it.
Yeah. So initially you were just like a writer, or you were interested in writing?
I was interested in writing. Okay. And I was working as a copy editor. I was doing some freelance journalism. And then I started shooting a couple of things freelance as a stringer for the newspapers. Nothing interesting at all.
Yeah.
But then as I started documenting what I was doing out there in the rural areas, it became a lot more interesting.
Yeah.
And I found a voice, a photographic voice that, I wanted to document and record. I felt a historical imperative, even though I really had no idea what I was doing in many ways.
Yeah. Interesting journey.
Well, it was going to be it's quite interesting. As I was starting to establish myself as a photographer, I made connections with a thing called Camera Press, which still exists in London as a photo agency. And there was this news that Mandela might be released, and oh, it's exciting, go down to Cape Town, cover it. And I said, but I've got this thing arranged up. I don't know if you know Hamojaji and the so-called Rain Queen, and I developed a good relationship with her, who was Mojaji the fourth.
Yeah.
And she allowed me to come to a lot of interesting ceremonies. So there was a big ceremony on that weekend, and it was going to be clear that Madiba was going to be released then. It was like, oh. And so I had all these assignments coming in that, one, I felt unsure I could actually deliver properly on. And two, I had this thing that I've been working for years on to build this relationship, and I didn't want to lose it. So I went up north to Limpopo and and these, up into Mojaji's area in the Kloof area, and instead of going to Cape Town. And it was quite bizarre. But anyway, it's one of those choices I made. So I wasn't really tuned into news. And then as the violence started between Inkatha and ANC and PAC and ZAPO, and of course all led through the Third Force and the formal police and military units that were doing this crap, I felt that I couldn't reflect on this experience. I couldn't honestly reflect on what I was seeing around me if I didn't cover violence. And then one day I just said, okay, I hear this stuff on radio. It is Radio 702, I believe. And I was busy doing some furniture repair work on my stoep. And I said, no, okay, off you go. There's a 25-minute drive to Soweto. And I got caught up in this murder, and I photographed this murder at hand's length. And it was a very shocking introduction to violence and news. But it also pushed me completely into photojournalism.
Yeah.
So that's my potted background.
Sure.
And yourself?
I think there's like quite a number of things that you've mentioned here that, I'd love us to like go back to, I think, later on and touch on them. So I think, for me also, like, my journey wasn't like really planned out, so I would say I got introduced to art, whilst in high school, and this is like not so long ago. I think it was around 2003, 2004, so when there's this high school friend of mine who had just like joined our school in our class. And he kind of like introduced me to hip hop music, which is something that's like growing up in Soweto. It wasn't that much popular, but we had like, Kwaito and other genres, So he introduced me to guys like Eminem and Tupac and Jay-Z and them, and I was so like fascinated with that. Also, not necessarily the politics, that a lot of like hip hop musicians brings up, but then it's just kind of like the lifestyle, and where everything seems like, the rappers are having like a good life, and also just the interest in poetry, the spoken word, and how, rap music and, how it plays around with like, poetry and stuff. And so we used to do this thing, I think now it's called like scrapbooking. So we used to buy a lot of music magazines, I think at the time that was one way that one could get access to music journalism, or you get to read about, your favorite artists. And I remember, I kept a huge file, where I would cut out like images of the favorite musicians and, interesting articles, that I would want to kind of like archive, so some of these magazines, they would document, graffiti, whether it's in Joburg or international, so I would also like was into that. So I would kind of like keep that file that, documents all of this. And I think around 2004 or 5, there was this television program called Street Journal, and I remember one day they were profiling Lolo Veleko, and who spoke about Market Photo Workshop, and it's a school of photography, and what the school does, offering bursaries and stuff. And she was quite like interesting for me because, just her presence and how she looked like. She had mohawk, and yeah, it was really like appealing to me, and I was like interested in her, and through her profile, she was showing kind of like the people that she was photographing. So like the alternative culture within the townships, how people dress up like differently. And then it's kind of like a way for them to claim like a different kind of like identity, So I went to Market Photo Workshop and I got to enroll there, and did the short courses, and yeah, so there were different courses there that one focused on photojournalism and documentary photography program. And then there was one, which was the advanced program. And, I wouldn't necessarily say it was looking at like the art practice, but then one could really be free and explore what they want to explore with the medium, And I was kind of like drawn towards that. And yeah, that's how I started,
I mean, the Market Workshop has been such a great incubator. It's remarkable.
Yeah.
So it's fabulous that you saw what you liked and you explored it and found your voice within it. I mean, Lola's work is amazing. And then, I mean, I guess from a point of view of practice, when did you start? How did you find your path through from this interest into a profession?
Yeah, so I think also it happens whilst at Market Photo Workshop, so I think the school was great, or it's great because of the idea that, so you would do classes, that you're supposed to do, and then afterwards they had like programs or mentorship programs that somehow launched, young promising photographers, so one of those mentorship programs was the Edward Ruiz Mentorship, which in 2008, I got awarded with that. And so what the award entailed was that you have to work with a mentor for a period of a year to develop a body of work that would be exhibited at the end of the program. And I think for me, that mentorship kind of like, helped me in a way, like carve a path, So I developed this body of work titled Alternative Kids. So basically looking at me and my friends, and kind of like our fascination with alternative culture. And it was a very intimate body of work that I've developed working with about 3 or 4 mentors, and it got, at the point where it got exhibited, like it got like a good response, and people warmed up to it quite greatly. It was something that was not new, but then fresh, so that people had an interest in. And
I beg to differ. It was very fresh. It was new. It was definitely new. It had a great look and feel to it. Yes, of course.
Oh, yeah, that's great.
So I thought it really. It's interesting. There were a group of people doing vaguely similar stuff, but yours was the one that had the clearest vision translating into aesthetic, I think. At that time.
At that time, yeah. So yeah, it was quite a number of things there, because I think aesthetically as well, the idea of working with black and white and using a flash, I think it had been influenced a lot, I think around that time, by this idea of like alternative music and punk rock, just like black and white images of, just kids on the streets or in the clubs, nightlife, And I was in love with that kind of like aesthetic, and I was looking at a lot of films by, Jim Jarmusch, so that were like black and white. So that aesthetic for me like quite worked nicely. And, you know, the idea of the exhibition for me was to kind of like bring that aesthetic into the gallery. And I think, you know, throughout my shows, like that's what somehow I've kind of like grounded as my language, you know.
I mean, I think it's got a very South African look and feel to it. I mean, if you place it in a kind of historical or historio-political context, it was this when kids were not taken to the streets as part of their growing up, they were really looking to identify themselves through something entirely different, not through politics or not through overt politics. And there was the sudden flourishing of this a freedom of choice in enjoyment as well, whereas previously it had been, one didn't see this, you know, one didn't see this in the 80s, 90s. It was older people, it was the hostel thing, it was, you know, whereas yours was kids taking the lead, and I think it was linked to the Born Frees and that feeling of being young in a time of liberation. I mean, how do you feel about, is that accurate to how you were perceiving the work or not?
Say that again.
Is that how you were perceiving the work in a way?
I mean, you know, I think for me, I was very much like caught up, you know, in canceling everything else, and then just like being interested in this idea that our voice is unique, you know. So and also I think for me, it's like also, I think for a while with my work, you know, I was fascinated by my work and what I'm trying to say, but then like I couldn't really pinpoint why people responded to it like they did, you know. So I think at that time also, you know, I wasn't much like aware of, you know, just like the political history and its impact, and, you know, where South Africa, you know, is and its transition and stuff, you know. So at that point for me, it was really about the work and then what is it that we're doing, you know. But then, you know, I think more and more, like I started to understand the fact that, you know, my work somehow reflects, you know, the times, you know, that I'm documenting, you know, young people. And you know, I think for me, you know, I'd love to also just like pose this question to you, because you've kind of like touched on it a bit, that, you know, when you started seeing these violence or hearing about these violences that were happening, you know, in South Africa, you couldn't turn a blind eye on them, and you wanted to reflect on them, you know. So what did that mean to you?
So many things. I mean, this was now suddenly more overt violence than we're used to. I mean, apartheid was not especially subtle in its violence, but you didn't see it all the time, right? The whole system was to hide it unless you were living in a black area that happened to be resisting, and then nothing was hidden. So when this violence and very, very emphatic violence, you know, it's not like low-key street punches, or it was killings on a large scale. And of course you had the apartheid military and police who were there with all their weaponry. And it felt, it's complicated to explain the whole thing, but there was this concept which was voiced by Mandela and others in the ANC and some journalists, that there was a third force at work, i.e. the third force comes from Latin America, the concept that the incumbent regime uses hidden arms to undermine any opposition to itself. And there was no way to prove this. And one of the things that drove me and some other journalists who were alive to this possibility was to try and find this and try and see it, to prove it, because before Photoshop and before digital photography, there was a trust in what the negative was, I think. So I tried very hard to photograph this, going out in the dark and photographing the most dreadful things, but always just missing what might have been evidence of this, according to the people that I spoke to. Oh, you just missed, we'd had this and a cop dressed in blackface, all this kind of stuff. But eventually it was proven to be true when at the TRC, military and police units admitted to whites and black people, admitted to going on the trains and doing that mayhem on the train violence that was a noticeable in 1990, 1991 especially. So this was a real thing, but it's so difficult to prove and capture. And one never knows what the truth is. This is the thing, right? You don't know what the truth is and what is the whole truth. Oh, complicated.
I mean, you know, like what you're saying about this idea of what the truth is, whether third force or what, you know, I was looking at your work the other day, and you know, I wouldn't even like attempt, you know, if something like that should happen, to try and photograph it. You know, it's like, you know, you and some of your peers, like, you know, the violence that you were able to capture, you know, looking at it now, it's like, you know, it's hectic, you know. And I wanted to bring something, because, you know, at the moment, you know, in South Africa, you know, I'm sure you are aware of this, there's just like this absurd like amount of gender-based violence. I mean, every day, you know, you hear about either a woman being killed or a woman found dead somewhere. And, you know, it's, and just hearing that, and, you know, comments about Black South African men, you know, who are doing this. And in fact, yeah, that. And then also by looking at these images that you guys have produced, it's like the amount of violence that Black men in the township in particular, like, got kind of like exposed to. Do you think there might be a link there, or with whatever it is that is happening now, with just like the amount of violence that was happening at the time that you guys like documented?
So I understand the kind of impulse to think that Black South African males are especially violent towards women. And whereas it is a huge problem, it's not constrained to Black males. I mean, I remember in the 80s, before this violence started, the numbers of white men doing these murders, I'm not sure if that, it's before your time, I think, but maybe there's a collective memory of this. But white men who lost their work or whatever it was, instead of committing suicide, some of them would kill their entire families and then commit suicide, because no one could exist without it. And I think this patriarchy is so strong in South African culture. So part of it is within Black culture, within this macho culture, and within white culture, and that whole kind of it's based in religion, it's based in culture, it's based in history. And then you have the violence and the oppression of apartheid adding to everyone's sense of it's a zero-sum game. There is no middle ground. And I think all that adds to the potential for people to be violent. So when you get people suddenly exposed to violence, it's not like they're horrified, they're never going to think of attempting anything like that themselves. It raises the bar for what's allowed and what's doable. And you see it so much. It's dreadful.
Yeah, I mean, it's like that's why it's like scary, because it's like this thing of, you know, when you drive every day to work or wherever, and then you see someone begging, you kind of like get desensitized from that, right? It's like the very same thing that's happening with the numbers for like COVID-19. So at some point, people are just like, okay, it's numbers, you know. And I think my fear, like personally, it's that, you know, we're gonna keep on hearing about this, and then it becomes, you know, something that is just, you know. So you know, I think we can agree that photographs, you know, they work as like historical documents. And for me, that's why, like, when I was looking at your work, I started like thinking, Jesus, you know, this kind of violence, could it? And then I start asking questions that, could this be the reason we're seeing this amount of violence? You know, how do we use, like, you know, these images that you and your peers have kind of like worked with, or that have produced, you know, to kind of like, you know, I don't know, whether it's educating or I don't know, to reflect to whatever it is that is happening now?
I mean, that was the original intention of the work. My personal motivation was that if one showed this, which is why nobody had photographed a murder happening when I had done that murder happening, and the next one, which we went on to win the Pulitzer and those things, that series. Nobody had photographed that happening because A, it's a rare occurrence to be able to get access to that, and B, the chances of intersecting with one of these events is pretty small. But with the amount of time that I was putting in, it was almost inevitable that I would come across it. But it was so disturbing. It was so anti my worldview and my politics to see this. But I felt I couldn't not show it or censor myself, because I strongly felt at that time that if it was seen, sanity could be restored and people would pull back from this, what is obviously building into a dreadful, dreadful epoch that turned out not to be true. So now if we look at it from this point of view, can we use that material in a way to educate ourselves, to have people turn away from the violence? I don't know. I don't know if it's got that value. I think if it was contextualized deeply in the fabric of poverty, in the fabric of emasculation that happens to very macho men who become more macho to try and fight this emasculation when, to take a stupid example, maybe not stupid, but maybe an exaggerated example, the whole thing of how a white madam would call a man older than her a garden boy and roam around the garden. That's, never mind the race and gender, to do that to anybody is a very crappy way to deal with human beings. But if you put it into this context, into the greater context of this person being a migrant worker away from his or her family, it builds up into a situation where it's just tinder waiting for a flame. And there's such hatred and there's such fear. The reason that why are these average white people so racist? Not all of them have got animosity built into their heart from birth. Some have, of course, but I think it's the way that information and propaganda has built up this fear. The old swart gevaar was a real thing. We see it happening in politics now. We look at the politics in America, and so that it's like it's gobsmacking that we can't learn. So I don't know what showing that work as a way of saying we don't want this to continue would do. I think we have to think of a very intricate and smart approach if that's to be done.
Do you think photojournalism as a genre though has got a potential to, I don't know, to not necessarily like to raise awareness, but then to create works that somehow would get, people to think about these things?
Sure. I think journalism is a very important aspect of society and how we inform ourselves. But I think it's the entry point, right?
Yeah.
By its nature, it's truncated. And yes, nowadays we do have quite a lot of long-form journalism online, but the majority of people look at is very tiny little bits of information. And I think it's important, but also terribly dangerous. If you look at, if you take an example of a single news photograph of Bloody Sunday in Ireland, right? When the British Army opened up on Republican protesters, and then you look at an in-depth body of work on that, like Gilles Perez's work from there. It's a completely different understanding we come away with, because there's nuance, there's intricacy, there's real life, it puts things in context. It allows you to judge without being forced to think in only one way because your information is so circumscribed. And I think that's the danger of journalism and why it's also so open to being misused.
Yeah. Sure. I don't know. I just wanted to, I've got a few questions, and sorry to just like put you on the spotlight.
No, go ahead.
Because also, it's like there's what we call, or what is called, like community journalism, where, people, who are on the scene or who are in the communities get to tell about the story before even, like, maybe trained photojournalists or journalists, get to even tell the story. But, you're touching on the idea of, looking at the larger body of work as opposed to just like one image that either goes on social media and then there's all sorts of comments, Do you think with the way, the world like consumes information right now, looking at Instagram, Twitter versus, there seems to be a big shift towards like, either artists or whether journalists or what, moving towards the gallery space, where there's more exhibition and, artists working with curators too. Do you think photojournalism has got like, I don't know, a position
that's a lot. That's a lot of stuff you've got. Can I break it down into separate things? And first of all, Musa, maybe I just want to respond. Marina's asking a question. Will they be sharing images? So I think if you need to see the work we're talking about, it's very distracting to show it while we're talking. But in the link, you should be able to just Google our work and find it easily enough. And I think the invitation had links. If not, maybe Lauren can just log it into the chat and people can go to it.
Go and view,
So photography is such an immediate and powerful language, right? Most of us are unaware of how visually literate we are, but once we take it apart and look at what we understand about imagery and be more conscious about it, we realize just how powerfully it affects our brain. And I don't want this to be misinterpreted. Photojournalism can be absolutely truthful and honest, yet totally misleading, much like any other photography. So that's the one thing, because it's this tiny sliver of time looking in one tiny direction out of 360 in a scope of geographic and spatial changes. How do we choose which picture becomes what we look at social media, which one gets discussed and commented on and circulated? It's complex. And I think it's so easy to willfully put some kind of fake message on a photograph. So photography without context or captions or accompanying information is devilish in a way. And that's one of the reasons that my pictures from 1990 in Nxumalo, I don't let them get used unless it's in context and it's not for social media. I don't print it, nothing. It's just too disturbing to be used out of context. And it feeds into the whole thing that the government, the then South African government, the white apartheid regime, was trying to push, was that blacks can't be in charge of the country because they look at what they are. They're just savages. Now, the problem was that this picture was a perfect example that could fill that role. And it wasn't what I believed. It's not what I understood about the situation, but it's accurate to what is happening in front of the camera. And that's a big problem, right? So if we look at photojournalism moving into other space, I think this is about intention, right? So my work was always, to me, documentary, even though I was working for news organizations, whether shorter form or medium form, from Wires to that. For example, if I was shooting for AP or for Newsweek or for the New York Times, I always carried a camera in black and white because all the commercial people wanted, all the outlets wanted color, right? So it's either color slide or color negative. But 90% of the time I carried a black and white body that I shot my own work on. That was part of my capturing of the narrative, that, and having a different camera body separated from trying to achieve journalistic goals. It was just what I wanted to record. And obviously there's a big overlap on these things. But that body of work was a separate thread. And to me, it gave me a sense that there was a historical reckoning that would be done one day, that it could be presented. I wasn't clear what it was. I was too caught up in current affairs and dealing with all those things that were happening, and the good, the bad, and the ugly. And but I did have this understanding that there was a historical thread to the work that would fit in somewhere, somehow. And also, we didn't know where this was going to end, right? So if you say, okay, we know 1994, there's going to be a general election, Mandela's going to become president, and the war's going to stop, more or less. It drifted on a bit. But you didn't know that in 91. 91 looked like the apocalypse. If you were in Koza in Nxumalo Street in 91 or down one of the side alleys, the world was ending.
Yeah.
It was the most dreadful place to be. So I think it's imperative, it's important that the work be contextualized in a way that you see the thread, because we see the manipulation, and we, without getting currently political, but the kind of the head of Inkatha, Mangosuthu Buthelezi, Chief Mangosuthu Buthelezi, he was a warmonger, and now he's being portrayed as this elder statesman, all this respect. It's bullshit. These people were warmongers who got to the top. You look at people, I don't know, people in KwaZulu-Natal, in Pietermaritzburg, there's Harry Gwala, who was the Stalinist ANC warlord, and he was opposed to, and I've got completely dropped his name now, it'll come to me, but he had an opposing Inkatha warlord, and these guys knew each other so well, so intimately, yet and they were both older, and they sent these young men to kill each other, and to kill women, and to kill whoever they could. We should lionize these people? I don't think so.
Yeah.
So I think if you contextualize this and you put that all together in a way that allows people to come to their own conclusions instead of imposing thoughts on them, I think that's critical. While you're answering, I'm going to look at the questions.
Okay.
Okay. We'll get to iPhones later, I guess.
Get to those, yeah. So I think when when you're talking about contextualizing the importance of contextualizing the works or photographs, I think that's why for me I was drawn more and more into the way I work. So I think from early on, I've always seen my work in the gallery space, but my thinking around like the gallery space had to do with more of I think having some kind of like control in how people see or view the work, and so first of all, the way that I practice or the way that I create images, it's similar to someone who's doing weather reportage or documentary photography. So I'd go into nightclubs, and look for images, but in terms of the way then the work is shown, this is where, I get very much involved in terms of, how the work feels in the gallery space and how, the work is shown, the narratives, how one work follows the other and stuff like that, and so I have not necessarily like full control, but then I have a control in how, the audience, gets to come in and read the work, and I've always run with that. And then it also goes back to the idea of winning that Edward Ruiz Mentorship and then having to take or having to learn about the idea of having to take ownership of what you get, of what you release out there, So kind of like what you were mentioning, when you say, there's images, that, you would make sure that they don't just like go out there because, the context might be different. And then, so I think earlier on, somehow you touched on the shifts that happens in photography, So I'm quite like interested in knowing also your perspective in terms of how photography has shifted. I think not only since your days of like practicing, but maybe even like maybe years before that, and then seeing what's happening now. I think also it might even answer Kerry's questions about having iPhones, images and stuff.
Long answer. I'm trying to think of how to make it shorter.
Yeah.
So I think it's about representation. Photography has always been about how we represent ourselves and how we represent others. It was initially a portrait medium, essentially, or a landscape medium before people could sit still long enough. But its commercial interest was in portraying people, much like the early portrait painters, the pictorialists, right? So that was its roots. There's a fascination with how we see ourselves and with how others see us. As the medium went from this cumbersome 2-minute or 3-minute or 5-minute exposure time that you had to sit still in, if you look at August Sander's work and that kind of stuff. August Sander, Sander, wonderful portraiture, and how his work developed over the time. I have a whole lecture on this, but and then you go to, once cameras became faster and quicker to use, and they could be more spontaneous. So you still could do the slow, careful portrait. If you think of in terms of not similar to your work, but in the same vein as your work, Zanele Mohole's work of portraying queer people and how they represent themselves, that's very careful. Nothing is left to chance, and the sitter is as much a part of the photograph as Zanele's work, in that part of her work. And I think that's a critical part of photography that'll always be with us, no matter what the medium is, whether it's a selfie iPhone, or someone going back to some old-fashioned large format 8x10 film photography. It's the same thing. It's trying to show something more than the physical through a photograph.
Yeah. I think I quite like that, because it's the medium is the medium, right? It's the tool, it's a screwdriver. It doesn't matter like how one uses it, but
if only it was as cheap as a screwdriver.
Yeah, but like it goes back again to this thing of the intention and the context, right? So how do you intend, so whatever subject that you choose to deal with, it's all about how do you intend that like it goes out, and what is it that you want people to take from it, and also just like putting it in context, so that it's basically like your voice, and so tools, they're not necessarily, tools are tools.
Yeah, but I mean, they affect us, right? So the way that a tool is designed to work has a big effect on how we use it. If you look at these old-fashioned cameras behind me, they all work in slightly different ways, and they'll affect how you create the images you want. If it's a cell phone, it's very difficult to shoot outside of how it's designed to shoot, quite honestly. So the choice of tool affects how we portray or depict things. If I think of your work, it's such a distinct voice that comes through. I mean, I see some influence that might or might not be there in your head, but you have something very clear to say. It's about the moment and the off moment, about culture and people living within this moment. It wasn't intended as news. It wasn't intended as journalism. It wasn't intended to go out in the next day's newspaper and how that would be read. So as you said, you were looking at gallery space. That was your intention. And I think, whereas you can never control how someone feels or thinks or understands your photography when they look at it, you had an intention of what you wanted to express. So I think
the tools.
So I think there's the tools are not separate from the mediums of production, right? There's the one thing that the tool that takes the image, but 80% of what is not seen is how that picture gets distributed, how it finds an audience, right? So Instagram, Facebook, gallery space, newspapers, books, these things, talking about them, writing about them, art, art criticism, talking about photography in terms that photographers don't think about mostly, right? Or they learn to desperately.
Titling versus captioning.
So exactly. So there's so much, and who is it aimed for? Who's your audience? I mean, if you're taking pictures for those people in your pictures, or are you taking pictures for people in Constantia to look at those pictures, or London, So I think, if I may refer to the late David Goldblatt, he gave a talk once where he said he'd slowly come to realize and to act on that he wasn't interested in taking photographs for people who weren't intimate with the circumstances. So he was shooting for a South African audience who was alive to what he was seeing in those pictures. He didn't want to have to shoot in a way that could be understandable to people who didn't have background knowledge, which is kind of interesting. So in other words, he's shooting for himself in a way by the end of his career.
That's very interesting. I think I once got a criticism from one of my friends who appears a lot in one of my photographs. He said to me, your work is not art, and that was quite like a stab. It's like, what do you mean? Because so he's a musician, and his thing is he creates album covers, and it needs to have lots of graphics and stuff like that. And there was quite for me, I think, a shift in terms of what I wanted to achieve with my work based on the people that I work with professionally and the people that are sitters in my work, or the people that I photographed, where there was a bit of a disconnect. It's they'd be why don't you make it look much more beautiful, whereas it's just simple black and white and with the flash. So there was quite that shift. And in terms of the intention and your audience, I think for me it took me a while also to understand who my audience is, because yes, I work with the gallery. You understand there's a collector, there's art writers or reviewers, and there's institutions who are interested in this whatever it is that you're dealing with. And so, but then I never understood what is my audience and what is it that they want and stuff. So it is always being me wanting a voice and trying to shape this voice. And since started practicing, and now also the understanding of whether it's a collector or what has shifted, because suddenly now you have people who put art in their homes and who are young, us who are black, and they don't earn a whole lot of money to be able to acquire that. So there's quite a shift, and I quite like what you're saying about David Goldblatt, that at some point you realize that he's doing it for himself. So there's constantly this need to want to understand either the world that you're living in, or yourself, and I think that's quite a shift that I've took with my work. Especially I've seen it on my current show that opened a couple of weeks ago, where I think just with this thing of the issues of the gender-based violence that since lockdown also kind of escalated, and being a young black man in South Africa as well, and not knowing what to say, how do I even start commenting about that, So I think I've put in a lot of those emotions in the work, or that energy in my work, because it's not only about the gender-based violence that's happening here. It's black men in America that get killed every day by the police. So kind of that energy or that tension, it's something that I quite channeled in the show in terms of like how one experiences it and stuff. And, you know, I think at this point I'm more and more like quite, you know, intending to do that, intending to just like have my work channel the energy, whatever it is that like one is feeling or is going through at the moment, you know?
I think that's so good, and it's why your work succeeds. You know, one can sense it's authentic, and I think maybe there are people who can fake it, but maybe not. Maybe not well.
Yeah.
So I think yes, it's about what the power is of photography in a certain epoch, right? So at the moment, it's very much about understanding your circle.
Yes.
Right. And the other thing is understanding the planet, but how do you depict that without, you know, some kind of massive travel plan and that? And I think it's this intimacy of photography is nothing if it's not an intimate medium. And I mean, I like that about your work. I like that about the best of my work, because obviously we've been talking about the violence of my work, but there's the vast majority is not violent, and it's about context and space and people living in normal times, and something that, even though I was unaware of it, approaches the kind of American new topographic school of photography, the Lewis belts and those kind of things, where space and architecture and lived space stands in for the people. And that's always been an interest to me, which I only recognize now. So that's clearly
I mean, like I was looking at your portfolio, and you know, the violence and the closeness. You know, it's like even at this portfolio that I was looking at, I think it's the one you did. It's on your website.
Oh, for Strauss & Co. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, even that, it's like, even though it's like violence and, you know, that we're looking at, and, you know, you're working there as a photojournalist, but the closeness, you know, because, you know, it's how closer you are in there with the people. It's like seeing people's expressions, like whether it's fear or it's just like anger and everything. That closeness for me, it's like, you know, it's important, and in photography, and I think also in just like, you know, in everything else that one does. I think, you know, for the past 4 years, you know, I've been kind of like working as a curator, and you get to understand, like, also working with artists, you know, it's not a matter of going to a studio at some point and then be like, oh, that and that work, and then you put them in the gallery space, but then being close, like, with the artist, and then somehow trying to figure out, you know, whatever it is that they're trying to do, being, you know, in close proximity like that, you know, it quite helps in terms of like how the work comes out as. And, you know, for me, that's where the meaning is, you know, when you're able to be close with whatever it is that you're doing.
So I absolutely thank you, because that's really what I feel about things. And that's the one thing with photography, is that I always want to be right in there. And as much as I don't like wide angle photography, there's a lot of it in my historical work, because I felt I couldn't represent people's lives, these unbelievable moments in people's lives and in communities' lives, if I wasn't physically in the same place, literally standing in their shadow or casting a shadow over them by how close I was. And I think, and I always wanted to get in. And I think this goes back to my kind of, you know, I used photography and journalism really as a passport to other people's lives, because of my curiosity, maybe because of trying to find another life, and to see and to examine my own life through that, or to examine paths. And I always feel frustrated, though, as close and as intimate as some of those weird pictures are, in terms of it's moments that nobody should ever be intimate with, but there is that. And I think if that translates even to someone who's as attuned a watcher as you are, I'm pleased. I mean, if you think about people who've done really intimate work, and on the wall behind you is a cutout, a remake of Diane Arbus's famous Little Boy with a Hand Grenade in the New York Park. Her work was unbelievably intimate, but it was also cynical and almost toxic, except for that little bit of gentleness and understanding that she brought. But that is a reflection of who she was. And I think that's the best part of photography, is that it can be such an intuitive medium that it can absolutely show more about you than it does about the subject. And I think that's
you see, for me, and I think this might be like my last point, because I see now you're like about to close.
Already.
I think for me, that's what like I'm forever grateful for when it comes to photography. The fact that, you know, it really requires you, I think somehow, firstly, this intimacy, or you need to be close or have a good interest in what you're doing, but then also the ability for you to step back, you know, like to get outside of yourself and be like, okay, you know, this is not about me. You're not like in the forefront. You're like, okay, now I'm looking, I'm studying, or I'm getting to know the situation or these people that I'm around. And I think that has also like helped me a lot when it comes to, you know, my work as a curator that I'm like quite like interested in doing now, because suddenly I'm able to work with other artists and take a step back and get to be in their lives and their creative processes and how they think. And it's such an amazing thing and a privilege, you know, to be able to be with like other artists and get like how they function. And, you know, I can only credit it to how photography, you know, requires, or the practice rather, you know, requires you to take a step back and to study and to listen and to look, you know. So
I think that's right, and I think that's part of our fascination with photography. Is what do we want to live with? You know, do you want to live with a book? Do you want to use a newspaper today and fish wrapping or toilet paper tomorrow, or do you want to put that photograph on your wall and live with it for a year, and how you relate to it? And that's art, but art doesn't have to be this distanced intellectual thing. It's also very personal, very visceral, and it can come from a different place. It's how we perceive it.
Yeah, sure. Great, man.
It's been lovely.
Quite enjoyed it.
We should do this again.
Yeah, I was about to say that. Now we've got our contact, and I will just like hit you up and then.
Absolutely. Let's discuss. Let's discuss. I'd love to. And I think maybe we can arrange a forum that's more. It's difficult with this online stuff, but we're saying it's more proactive, where the audience can get more involved, where we can see them and relate to them. I think that'll be great, because, you know, two voices is one thing, but opening it up can be interesting.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Greg.
Thank you, Musa, and thank you everyone for participating.
Cool. Cheers.
Bye.